Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, I am going to give you a few tips about painting on Procreate. And yeah, I did kind of paint 100 plus portraits and other paintings on Procreate. And that doesn't even include the trash paintings that I made. So yeah, hopefully I can give you some pointers that will help you out and be beneficial to anyone who does paint on Procreate or any other digital device. I also come from a traditional background, so these tips might even be helpful to anyone who sketches or paints. So yeah, let's get started. The number one thing that I would like you as a beginner to know about is that you cannot outpaint a bad sketch, just like you cannot outwork a bad diet, right? Unless you have done this a dozen times and unless you have developed those abilities to observe and see things, see your subject in a different way, then I would really recommend you to get better at sketching. The more you practice it, the less details you will require to have in your sketch. But yeah, that takes some time, and when you learn to observe and see things, then it gets easier. Like even with this painting, I did have an initial sketch, even though it wasn't the exact reflection of the reference that I was seeing. At least I had some foundation before I put in the colors. And trust me, even if you have like 4 lines indicating where the head starts, the jawline, the nose line, the brow ridge, you want it to be at least like 90% accurate. You want to have like 90% likeness to the original portrait or whatever subject you're drawing. And if you are a beginner, then this is really a non-negotiable item. It doesn't matter if your painting has multiple subjects or is it complex. You want to have the rough guidelines in, and you want to have a good foundation. Like you can see me doing this in my color study in which I am studying Ilya Repin's painting. I did have a basic indication of where everything was before I put down any base colors. The second thing that I would like you to think about whenever you sit down to make your next painting is, did I really study my reference or am I just painting without being mindful of it? And by studying the reference, I really mean actually taking 5 to 10 minutes out and actually seeing it. Like in this reference, in this case, I'm seeing that the portrait is really sticking out because it is a lighter value and she's angry, and that all kind of sticks out against the dark background. And you should do this for every reference. See the base color of her hair, see the base color of her skin, see how the face angle is, see how much of the right eye is visible, and notice for all these changes. And whenever you're painting, I would highly recommend that you don't use any flat references. Like this was a big mistake that I used to make, and you really have to be selective with the kind of references that you use. Like using a reference in which the subject is being hit by light source from the front is not a good idea. In this painting even you can see that the light is coming from his left hand side and right side of his face is in shadows. And that really makes the whole composition more interesting than it would have normally been if the subject was just being hit by one light source from the front. And you would be able to see so many painters who use interesting references and not the ones in which the subject is being hit by harsh light from the front. And try to spare some time and do these color studies as often as you can. Even if it's like 2 or 3 times in a week and each painting takes you like an hour or two to make, just do them because you're going to learn so much about how color works. And it can be something as little as color not moving down straight down when it's going into the darker side, but it actually increasing in saturation when the light doesn't really reach that part. And the more you do these things, the more you learn about them. And when I used to paint digitally a while ago, I used to make so many color studies like this one. And at this point, I noticed that the eye was looking a little off, so I decided to change it a little bit. As you can see, I used my liquify tool and moved it up. I think that happens with a lot of artists actually, where you call it a day and then you're finished with the color study, and then for a week you don't open it, but after 7 days you open it and you're like, what is this trash? Like, I didn't paint that. Drawing anything digitally, you also have this feature in which you can flip your canvas horizontally and see if the portrait still looks believable. And even with these quick color studies, I always go with a rough sketch. Like it doesn't matter if it's super detailed, but there has to be some foundation. Then the rest of the process really becomes easier for me. Here's another color study that I made, and again, this also has a rough sketch. This is so loose and it really doesn't hold that much information, but again, I know when to stop because I know what level of information that a sketch carries would be enough for me before I jump into colors. And again, it also kind of depends upon what kind of complexity the drawing has, but for these color studies, I think you're good to go with the basic foundational sketch. And with these things, I would really recommend that you also learn some basic color theories. Like, just like you cannot use a color straight out of the tube when you're doing some traditional painting, you just cannot use a straight saturated yellow or red or orange and use that as a skin color like this, because that doesn't really make sense. No one has a skin color like this. To study this, you can actually color pick from whatever you've painted up until that point, or just use the reference and color pick from there. What you'll find out is that the colors are actually very desaturated, that none of the colors that you use in a face or skin or anything like that is a saturated version. Like, you can see that here. It lies in the grayish region. Even if it's darker in value, it's not going to be much saturated. And the color relationships are really subtle. Like, if you move from the jaw area to the cheek area, which is receiving light, it'll lighten up just a little bit in value and just a little bit in saturation too. Its saturation will decrease and it'll also move up. I would highly recommend that you use the color picking tool to understand the value relationships and how these kind of change as the form changes. But I'm not a big fan of actually color picking the color straight out of references and then putting them down on the canvas. Not that anything's wrong with that, but if you actually want to get good and you want to paint, and especially if you want to go into traditional painting like I do after this, then you really want to get good at understanding how color works, then rather than just copy and pasting it from the reference. And another example that I would like to show you, which would prove that not many saturated colors exist in actual subjects, is this one. Like, if I were to color pick any color out of this painting that I've made, it would be really a desaturated version of the color. It wouldn't be highly saturated, and of course the complexion is not dark, so it's going to be a little higher in the value scale as well. And it wouldn't be shifting towards the right, that is, it wouldn't be increasing in saturation. Like, I think traditional painters have a much bigger advantage when they shift to digital paintings because they really know how do complementary colors work. The reason for that is the colors that the traditional artists use, they're really saturated. Like, they're not desaturated versions that they can just pick out of the color wheel. Like, if they were to use any saturated red, then they would really have to mix in a bluish green or a green color which is complementary to red, just so they can bring down the saturation, and the red color would actually go towards the grayish region. Also, if it doesn't break the value and it works, then I would highly recommend that you get some complementary colors in your painting and see how the vibrancy changes, see how it desaturates the whole environment. And yeah, that tip kind of helped me out when I was just starting out. In this case, I'm just taking a reddish orange and then mixing it with some blue and experimenting how the saturation is changing. And it's just my opinion, but it's really hard to nail down the color. But in my eyes, value is just a little bit more important when you're drawing portraits, because the portraits are so much subtle in the value changes and the color changes that if you understand the values, like a lot of colors look similar when they come towards gray, and they look really different when they're saturated. And like I said, a lot of saturated colors, they don't really exist in nature unless you're seeing like trees and they're like super green. In portraits, that doesn't really work. So yeah, also get better at value studies and see how the subtle changes are in the reference. The next thing that I would like you as a beginner to know about is, especially if you're digitally painting, is, well, don't shy away from big brushes, and really, you don't really need any fancy brushes to make believable portraits. In this case, I think I'm using a charcoal brush that is stuck in Procreate, and you just get it with the app, and I'm using the biggest version of it possible and putting down the base value, some highlights, and then the shadows just to indicate where the form changes are taking place. This is the biggest mistake that I see beginner artists make when they're painting portraits. They shy away from the bigger brushes and they go really small. I did that myself, so I know. And I think that's such a beneficial exercise because it's going to help you out with simplification. Like, you just have to take an average color and then use the biggest brush, and then boom, you kind of end up right here where you're like, how did this even happen? But when you're working simply and you're not letting the details intimidate you, and you're just taking an average of the colors and then you're working from outside towards the in and then using the smaller brushes, then I think the paintings just looks better. And I really like to think about these paintings that I make on Procreate as a puzzle, and it's kind of a thing where it reveals itself to you. Like the more time you spend on it, the more it shows itself to you. And the last tip that I would like to give you to improve your paintings is just pay attention to how much observant are you. And observation is kind of like a thing. If you just play with the idea of making a great painting, then you will just keep playing and then you might not even end up there. But if you were to decide that you're going to be super mindful and super sensitive to whatever you're seeing in the reference, then you would probably end up with a painting which looks much, much better than, well, if you were not mindful. Like, as you can see, this painting looks finished, but when I was 30 minutes in, this looked like this, and it's straight up trash, right? But the thing is, observation is a key in every step of the painting. Like, when I was making this, I was observant. Even if it looks like a mess, I was still paying attention to the shapes and the color changes. I am often seeing these eye sockets as a shape, I'm seeing these colors as a shape. Like, if I had to compare this with something else, I would take the other eye socket and just take an average value or an average shape of that, and then I would find out the distance between them. And that distance will be used as a reference. I would like compare it to the reference that I'm seeing, and if it's too further away, then I would kind of use the liquify tool and then pull them back, and there will be a lot of pushing and pulling because this is obviously a digital portrait and I'm allowed to do these things, and well, it's not really possible in traditional painting, so might as well use this to my advantage when I'm painting digitally. And by the way, liquify tool, I wish something like that existed when you were painting traditionally, because that is the most helpful tool that I've seen. Like, you can just change your paintings. If the proportions are wrong, like, you can change it in the final stage, which is crazy. Like, I could be in the sketching phase like this, and if I don't like the shape of the jaw, I don't even have to erase everything. I could just change it. I could change the shape. I could change the position of the brow ridge or the shape of the nose, the lips, everything. It's just insane how that works. And if any one of you is coming from a traditional background, I would highly recommend that you experiment with digital painting as well. And if any one of you is coming from a traditional background and has an iPad lying around or any Wacom device, then I would really recommend that you experiment with digital paintings as well. You don't really have to shell out any extra cash for art supplies. You can experiment with like a million brushes, and there are like a gazillion canvas textures that you can just download off of Google. There's just so much it has to offer. Not that you even kind of need those things, but I'm just saying, like, I often use a round brush for most of my paintings. Like, I think there's a free set by Loish that I use for like 95% of my paintings, and well, yeah. Improvement really has to do with simplicity and just consistency. It doesn't need to be complicated. Like, I see so many people just wondering about what brushes the next person uses and all those other things, when it really takes a round brush to achieve like 95% of whatever you want to make. So I guess it's time to wrap it up here, and hopefully some of the tips helped you out, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video.